It has finally happened. The number that water managers, scientists, and millions of people across the American Southwest have been watching with dread has crossed the line that everyone hoped it would never reach. This week, Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, fell to the lowest level in its recorded history. The mark that had stood as the floor of the possible, the low point that had defined the outer edge of the reservoir's decline, has been broken. A record that reaches back roughly 90 years, all the way to the era when the Great Dam was completed and the reservoir first began to fill in the years that followed, has just fallen. The lake has never been this low, not in the lifetimes of anyone alive, not since the water first began to rise behind the concrete wall that created it. And that fact, stark and simple and impossible to argue with, is a warning written in the bleached rock of a desert canyon. It is the kind of milestone that ought to stop us in our tracks. A moment when a slow-moving crisis that has been building quietly for years suddenly announces itself in a single, undeniable number, demanding that we finally pay attention to a danger we have been able, until now, to look away from. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what Lake Mead is and what it represents. It is not just a lake. It is the beating heart of a water system that sustains the lives of tens of millions of people, that irrigates vast farmland, producing a significant share of the nation's food, and that powers homes and cities across a sprawling region that could never have grown so large without it. The reservoir was created by damming the Colorado River, capturing the river's flow, and storing it, turning an unpredictable desert waterway into a reliable supply that made the modern Southwest possible. The level of Lake Mead is, in a very real sense, the gauge that measures the health of that entire system. When the lake is high, the system is secure. When the lake falls, the system is in danger. And now the lake has fallen further than it ever has before. The record that just fell is not an ordinary record. It is not like a hot day that breaks the mark for a particular date, the kind of record that falls all the time and is forgotten by the next week. This is a record that had stood for the entire history of the reservoir, since the very beginning, since the water first pooled behind the dam in the years of its creation. For roughly 90 years, through droughts and wet years, through all the ups and downs of nearly a century, the reservoir had never been as low as it is right now. The previous record low, itself a shocking and alarming milestone when it was set, has now been surpassed, the water dropping past it, and continuing down into territory the reservoir has never occupied in all the years of its existence. To break a 90-year record is to enter genuinely uncharted ground, to reach a place the system has never been. And that is exactly where Lake Mead now finds itself. What makes the falling of this record so ominous is not merely the number itself, but everything the number represents and everything it portends. The decline of Lake Mead has not been a sudden event, but a long, grinding process, a steady drop that has played out over many years as the reservoir has lost a vast portion of the water it once held. The lake that once stood high against the canyon walls, deep and full and reassuring, has shrunk dramatically, retreating from its old shorelines, exposing a growing expanse of rock and sediment that had been underwater for generations. The most visible symbol of this decline is the so-called bathtub ring, the pale band of mineral deposits left on the canyon walls by the water that once stood there, a ghostly high watermark that now towers far above the shrunken surface. With each year of decline, that ring has grown taller, the gap between the old fullness and the new scarcity widening, and now with the record broken. That gap is the largest it has ever been. But why is this happening? And why now? The answer lies in a fundamental and worsening imbalance between the water flowing into the reservoir and the water being drawn out of it. For years, the Colorado River has been delivering less water than the system demands, and when more water is taken out than comes in, the reservoir inevitably falls. This imbalance has two roots, and understanding both is essential to grasping the crisis. The first is the long-term overuse of the river, the fact that the water was divided up and promised to the various states and users on the basis of an assumption about the river's flow that turned out to be too optimistic. More water was allocated than the river could reliably provide, so that even in normal times, the demands pressed against the limits of the supply. The second root is the drought, the extended dry period that has gripped the region and starved the river of its accustomed flow, reducing the amount of water arriving in the reservoir well below normal for years on end. And there is a deeper and more troubling dimension to the drying, because there is growing reason to believe that it is not simply an ordinary drought that will eventually end, but part of a lasting shift toward a hotter and drier climate. As temperatures rise, the effects ripple through the whole water system in ways that reduce the river's flow. Higher temperatures mean more evaporation, pulling water directly from the surface of the reservoir into the air. They mean that more of the precipitation that falls is lost before it can reach the river, absorbed by thirstier soils or evaporated away. They mean that the snowpack in the mountains, which feeds the river when it melts, accumulates less and melts earlier, and less completely. The warming acts as a kind of amplifier, intensifying the effects of the drought and reducing the river's flow beyond what reduced precipitation alone would explain. And because the warming is a long-term trend rather than a passing phase, it suggests that the low flows may be not a temporary misfortune, but a lasting new reality. Which would mean that the record now being broken is not a bottom, but a milestone on a continuing descent. This is the truly frightening implication of the record falling. A record low is alarming enough on its own, but what makes it genuinely ominous is the possibility that it is not the end of the decline, but merely the latest stage of it. If the imbalance between supply and demand persists, if the river continues to deliver less than the system takes, then the reservoir will continue to fall, and this record, shocking as it is, will itself be broken again and again as the water drops further into territory no one has ever seen. The breaking of the 90-year record is not necessarily the low point. It may be simply the newest low point, a marker on a downward path that has not yet reached its bottom, and that possibility is what transforms this milestone from a historical curiosity into a genuine emergency. The consequences of the falling reservoir are not abstract, because as the water drops, it approaches thresholds that carry real and serious dangers. The most immediate concern is the generation of electricity. The great dam that holds back Lake Mead is not just a barrier, but a power plant, using the force of the water passing through it to generate a substantial amount of electricity that serves a great many people. But this power generation depends on the water level being high enough to drive the machinery effectively. And as the reservoir falls, the capacity to generate power diminishes. If the level drops far enough, the ability to produce electricity at the dam could be lost entirely, removing a significant source of power from a region that depends on it and adding an energy crisis to the water crisis. The falling level thus threatens not just the water supply, but the electricity supply, compounding the danger with every foot of decline. Below the level that threatens power generation lies an even more frightening threshold, the level known as dead pool. This is the point at which the water in the reservoir falls so low that it can no longer pass through the dam at all, the level below which the remaining water becomes effectively trapped, unable to flow downstream to the cities and farms that depend on it. If Lake Mead were ever to fall to dead pool, the consequences would be catastrophic, because the delivery of water through the dam would cease, cutting off the supply to the vast population and the enormous agricultural operations that rely on it. Dead pool is the nightmare scenario, the ultimate failure of the system, and while the reservoir is not there yet, every record low, every further drop, brings that terrifying threshold closer. The breaking of the 90-year record is a step in the direction of dead pool, and that is why it inspires such dread. Consider, too, the sheer number of people whose lives are bound up with this water. The Colorado River system sustains tens of millions of people across multiple states, providing the water that fills their taps, that irrigates the fields growing their food, that supports the cities and industries where they work and live. Great desert cities have grown to enormous size on the strength of this water, their populations swelling in places that could never have supported them without the imported supply. Vast expanses of farmland, some of the most productive in the nation, depend entirely on the water delivered from the river, growing crops that feed people far beyond the borders of the region. All of this rests on the continued flow of the water, on the health of the system that the level of Lake Mead measures, and all of it is threatened by the reservoir's relentless decline. When the lake hits a record low, It is not a distant or specialized concern. It is a threat to the water security of a huge share of the population of an entire region and to the food supply of the nation beyond. The falling of the record also forces to the surface a bitter and difficult conflict, the struggle over how to share a shrinking resource. Because the system has promised more water than the river can provide. And because the drought has reduced the supply even further, there is simply not enough water to meet all the demands, and someone must use less. But every unit of water is claimed by someone who depends on it, a farm, a city, a state, an industry, and reducing the allocations means imposing real losses on real people who have built their lives around the water they were promised. The result is a contentious and high-stakes fight over who must give up water and how much, a conflict among the many parties who share the river, each seeking to protect its own supply, each reluctant to bear the cuts. The record low intensifies this conflict, because it makes the scarcity undeniable and the need for reductions urgent, forcing the difficult decisions that everyone would prefer to avoid. The rules that govern the water add another layer of complexity because they establish an order of priority, granting some users a stronger claim than others, so that when the cuts come, they do not fall evenly, and some parties face severe reductions while others are protected. This uneven distribution of pain is itself a source of bitter dispute, as those facing the deepest cuts resist their fate, and those shielded by seniority defend their advantages. And hanging over the whole struggle is the knowledge that if the parties cannot agree on how to share the shortage, the alternative is a chaotic and destructive scramble that would harm everyone. A breakdown far worse than any negotiated sacrifice. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how quickly this milestone arrived, because the speed of the decline is part of what makes it so alarming. For much of the reservoir's history, Lake Mead stood high and full, a deep blue expanse that seemed permanent, an inexhaustible reserve that few imagined could ever be seriously threatened. The old high water marks, recorded near the tops of the canyon walls, testify to a reservoir that once brimmed with water, holding a colossal quantity that appeared to guarantee security for generations. But over a relatively short span of years, that abundance drained away with startling speed, the level dropping and dropping as the imbalance between supply and demand did its relentless work. The previous record low, set not long ago, was itself a shock, a milestone that stunned observers and forced a reckoning with the seriousness of the crisis. And now, only a short time later, even that mark has fallen, the water continuing its descent into ever more dangerous territory. The pace of the decline suggests a system moving rapidly toward its limits, not gradually easing toward a stable new level, but accelerating toward the thresholds that must not be crossed. For the people who live in the region, this milestone carries a weight that goes beyond the numbers. Many have watched the lake shrink year after year with a growing sense of unease, seeing the shoreline retreat, the boat ramps stranded far from the water, the marinas forced to relocate again and again as the surface fell away beneath them. What was once a place of recreation and abundance, a great blue lake in the desert, has become a symbol of scarcity and decline, its exposed and cracked lakebed a daily reminder of the crisis unfolding around them. The record low is not just a statistic on a chart, but a visible, tangible reality for the communities that live in the shadow of the falling water, a sign that the world they have known is changing, that the security they took for granted is eroding, and that the future holds hard questions they cannot avoid. The anxiety that accompanies each new low is real, a background dread that grows heavier as the water grows scarcer. There is a natural cost to all of this as well, a toll on the living world that is easy to overlook amid the human stakes. The Colorado was once a wild and living river, sustaining a rich ecosystem along its length and flowing all the way to the sea, nourishing a vast delta where fresh water met the ocean. But as more and more of its water has been captured and consumed, the river has been diminished, its flows reduced, its natural rhythms disrupted, and in most years it no longer reaches the sea at all, its water entirely used up before it can complete its ancient journey. As the crisis deepens and the water grows scarcer, the pressure on the river's remaining ecological health only intensifies, because in a time of shortage, the water needed to sustain the natural world competes directly with the water demanded for human use, and the needs of the ecosystem are easily overridden. The falling of the record is a crisis for the living river as much as for the human civilization built upon it. So what can be done? The falling of the 90-year record is a dire warning, but it is not, at least not yet, a final verdict, because there are responses that can slow the decline and perhaps avert the worst outcomes. The most fundamental is to reduce the demand for water, to bring the total use into line with what the shrinking river can actually provide. This means using less water across every sector that depends on it, improving the efficiency of irrigation, which consumes the largest share. Reducing the cultivation of the most water-intensive crops, encouraging conservation in the cities, and finding ways to accomplish more with less. It means managing the system more wisely, reducing the water lost to evaporation and inefficiency, developing alternative sources where possible, and operating the reservoirs to protect the critical thresholds. And above all, it means the difficult work of reaching agreement among the many users on how to share the reduced supply, reforming the arrangements that govern the water to reflect the reality of a drier future. But these responses face enormous challenges, and there is no guarantee they will be enough. Reducing demand means imposing real sacrifices on people who depend on the water, and the political difficulty of deciding who must use less is immense. The users must reach consensus on how to share the pain, a task that has proven extraordinarily hard given the depth of the conflicts and the magnitude of the stakes. And the responses must contend with the possibility that the drying is permanent, that the supply will keep shrinking, so that even successful reductions in demand may be overtaken by further declines in the river. The challenge is not to close a fixed gap, but to keep pace with a supply that may continue to fall, and that is a far harder task, one that demands not a one-time fix, but a permanent transformation in how the region uses its water. This is the deeper meaning of the record that just fell. It is a signal that the era of abundance on which the modern Southwest was built is coming to an end. That the assumptions of endless water that underpin the region's explosive growth were never sustainable, and that the reckoning long deferred has finally arrived. For decades, the great reservoirs hid the fundamental imbalance between what the river could provide and what the region demanded, their stored water covering the deficit and masking the problem. But that buffer has now been drawn down to record lows, the hidden flaw exposed, the day of reckoning at hand. The falling of the 90-year record is the moment when the illusion of abundance finally gives way to the reality of scarcity, when the numbers can no longer be ignored, when the crisis that had been building for years becomes impossible to deny. And the lesson reaches far beyond the desert Southwest, because the pattern it reveals is not unique to this one river or this one region. Around the world, human societies have built themselves on the assumption of abundant resources, drawing on the bounty of nature as though it were inexhaustible. And around the world, that assumption is increasingly being tested as the limits become apparent. The crisis of Lake Mead is a particularly clear and dramatic example of what happens when human demands exceed what nature can sustainably provide, when a civilization builds itself on a foundation that cannot last. And because the drying appears to be driven in significant part by the warming of the climate, the crisis is also a preview of challenges that may come to many other places as the warming continues, a glimpse of a future in which the water supplies that societies have relied upon become less reliable, in which the assumptions of the past no longer hold. The bleached rock of the canyon walls, rising ever higher above the shrinking water, is a monument to this reckoning, a record written in stone of how far the water has fallen and how much has been lost. The breaking of the 90-year record is the latest and starkest entry in that record, a mark of a system pushed past the limits of its history. A warning that the lifeline of the Southwest is failing. Whether the region can respond, whether it can bring its demands into line with what the river can provide, whether it can build a sustainable future on the foundation of scarcity rather than the illusion of abundance, remains to be seen. But the warning could not be clearer. Lake Mead has never been this low. The record that stood for the entire history of the reservoir has fallen, and unless something changes, unless the imbalance is corrected and the decline is halted, this record will not be the last to fall, but merely the newest low on a descent that has not yet reached its end. The time to act is now, while there is still water behind the dam. And while the choice still belongs to us, rather than to the relentless arithmetic of a river that can no longer